Okay then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 201. I'm your host, Panyo Basa, and 201 is not a prime number. It is in fact 3 times 67. And I gotta put the little paper umbrella back into the beverage to introduce the beverage. Don't want you guys thinking I'm uncouth, uncivilized. Don't use paper umbrellas in my beverages. Now I throw it away again. Because we're having kind of some technical difficulties, and I've been investigating into the cause of said technical difficulties. And according to Grok, what's happening is I've got either a sample rate mismatch or a performance issue with the CPU overload causing encoding lag, and that does seem to be what's probably happening because my CPU, once it gets up to about 50%. In fact, I think it's lagging a little bit even now. It's at 28%. My CPU, it's like, the brain of my computer is at 28%, I guess, of capacity. And it causes a lag so that my voice and the movement of my mouth are not in sync. But I have a little bit to say about that on like a philosophical plane that's going to come up here before I actually start answering questions. So, I seem to remember that right as I was ending the Q&A last weekend, that it was like 2 people got some questions in right at the last minute as I was ending it, and I didn't notice. And so then I apologized in the comments under the Q&A and said I'd answer the questions next time, which is now. But it turns out that there's only one unanswered question at the end now. And I don't know if the other unanswered question disappeared or not, because some of the comments in the chat did in fact disappear. It's just all kinds of weirdness go on when I make these videos. Disappearing comments, lag between sound and mouth movement. Recently, I had a few videos where it sounded like I was talking from the bottom of a well. Just the audio just stopped working. I had to delete my video processing software and upload like an updated version of it just to get it to work again. I hope it's working now. And before I started using OBS, I was using the default video recording software on the computer, and there was one time I had to record the entire Q&A 3 times because it said it was recording. You see the little clock going, all that stuff looked like it was recording, said it was recording, and then I get to the end, didn't record. So my recording of Q&A videos has been just as just a regular occurrence. There's all this technical difficulty stuff coming up that I'll have a little bit more to say about it in a minute. But first, it seemed like the live stream went pretty well last weekend. And despite the lag that's wanting to happen now, the CPU is up to 52%. I don't know. Should I talk slower? I don't know. I should probably just get a new computer that's got more oomph to it. This is a relatively old computer, so I think probably next year, after I'm richer than I am now with my new job, I'll just buy a computer that has more guts to it. But as I was saying, the Q&A worked. It seemed to go pretty well, and I'm getting used to it now. So I may start doing live stream Q&As more frequently in future. But it seems to me that 2 p.m. American Eastern time probably is too late, because I have a lot of people who watch my videos in the Eastern Hemisphere, and they were like going to bed. They're like saying good night, everybody, in mid-afternoon my time. So I suppose I should probably, if I do live streams in the future, maybe like around noonish. I'll let you know before it happens. But I think around noon would be possibly ideal. I get up earlier now because I have to get up at the ungodly hour of like 4 o'clock to go to work now. And it looks like it's not going to be getting any better soon. I mean, that's 4 o'clock. I mean, there have been many more times I've gone to bed at 4 o'clock than getting up at 4 o'clock. I would much prefer, I mean, if I had my druthers, which I don't, but I would prefer to go to bed at 4 a.m. rather than get up at 4 a.m. But it's the curse of Adam. We must get up at 4 a.m. and earn our bread through the sweat of our brow and all that. So let's see here. Oh, we're getting back to what I was threatening you that I was going to get back to, and that is certain philosophical reflection on the technical issues that have plagued my channel, especially these Q&A videos. Like I've told you before, it's like a lag between, the audio and the video aren't in sync, or a few videos in a row. Just recently, it sounded like I was talking from the bottom of a well because the audio the video like processing software, just the audio just died. I had to like delete the software and upload like a different version of it. Before that, I was using completely different video recording software that sometimes didn't work at all. On one infamous occasion, I had to do the same Q&A 3 times before it finally recorded. It said it was recording and everything, didn't record. And to me, doing these videos is a kind of spiritual practice. It's like I'm directing my mind towards Dharma in a way that I usually don't at other times. Just being mindful or spontaneously oming or refraining from killing and lying and stealing and all that sort of stuff. I mean, that's just kind of chronic, a kind of baseline Dhamma practice. But when I'm doing these Q&A videos, it's more overt. It really is a significant spiritual practice for me and possibly for some of the people that listen. And because I view these videos through a kind of spiritual lens, at least a philosophical one, then my philosophical view that everything has to remain in balance. For every positive, you have to have a corresponding negative just to keep the cosmos in balance. So you've got goodness, you've got to have badness to balance it with. You've got beauty, you have to have ugliness just to compare it with, so that there is a kind of cosmic balance. That's how duality works. And I do think that just the strange technical difficulties that continually happen with my videos are a kind of cosmic balance. There's like the good aspect of me answering people's questions about Dharma, and then it has to be balanced out with some kind of negativity, which manifests in the form of crappy production quality. And I accept that. I mean, for me, the purpose of these videos is, as I say, kind of spiritual practice, sharing what I've learned, that kind of stuff. And I'm not doing it to make money or to get famous, that kind of stuff. I'm doing it as a kind of public service. And so when like negative stuff, with regard to, recording values, or production values or lack of production values, when that kind of stuff is happening, then I just kind of accept it philosophically. It's like, well, it's like Mara, the evil one, the cosmic balance, everything has to balance out. So the goodness of sharing Dharma just kind of gets counterbalanced by all these glitches and complications and technicalities and stuff. So I just kind of accept it philosophically. And it may be that, George Gurdjieff, I don't know if you're familiar with George Gurdjieff, but he was a Western philosopher who kind of was teaching Eastern philosophy through a kind of Western approach. And he believed that I mean, you shouldn't get your dharma too easily. He made his books deliberately difficult to understand because he felt like you shouldn't just have dharma handed to you on a platter. You shouldn't have any kind of profound truth or anything of value just given to you on a platter without you having to make any effort. And so, I can kind of relate to that. I mean, it's sort of like you listening to these Q&A videos. You have to exercise a little bit of patience or a little tolerance of my mouth not moving at exactly the same time as the words coming out. Or I sound like I'm talking to you from the bottom of a well. I mean, if it just doesn't record at all, then I just have to record the whole thing over again so you don't see it. I mean, this is like the third or fourth attempt, even just this evening, trying to get the lag, get the audio and video synchronized better. It's been taking some time. And it seems like it's going pretty well right now. It's within a second anyway. But on the bright side, just next year, I'll probably get a better, stronger computer. And then we can have like some totally new kind of fuckery interfering with these videos. But it's going to have to be something. It just seems like that's the way it is. And I sincerely believe in, this cosmic balance idea. It's sort of dependent core rising in Buddhism kind of works that way. Yin and yang in Taoism works that way. Karma to some degree works that way. And there is a question about karma kind of along those lines coming up. And I suppose I should just start answering questions then. Oh, my golly, there's not a whole bunch of questions this time. I guess everyone's just basking in the afterglow of the live stream, number 200 last weekend. But one of the questions that was asked at the end of the Q&A that I didn't get to is apparently from someone named Yatish. And Yatish says, should one be optimistic or realistic about the future, or should one not think about future much altogether? And if you're doing intensive practice, like really intensive Dharma practice, then as a general rule, you should be in the present moment. Be here now, as Ram Dass used to say, or the power of now. It's Eckhart Tolle's first famous book. So, yeah, I mean, if you're doing intensive practice, you should be mainly occupied with the present moment. And the Buddha, as well as Jesus of Nazareth, taught, give no thought for tomorrow, what you will eat, where you will sleep. Let tomorrow's problems happen tomorrow. You can deal with them then. So even if you are like doing intensive mindfulness practice, just be here now, and you have to think about the future, or you have to remember the past for whatever reason, then still there's this mindfulness going on of now, where it's like, I'm thinking about the future now, remembering the past now. There's still this nowness, even if you're thinking about the future or remembering the past. But if you're not doing intensive, like intensive practice, then you may have to think about the future more often. Let's say you work for some company, you're like in the environment, health, and safety department of some industry. So it's your job to be like extrapolating into the future and seeing what could possibly go wrong so that you can like prevent it from going wrong. So in a situation like that, you're going to have to think about the future. I mean, sometimes you just have to think about the future or the past. But if you're doing mindfulness really well, it's thinking about the future now, remembering the past now. But it should be kept to a minimum. To be in the present moment as much as possible is an invaluable spiritual tool. But with regard to Yatish's first question, and this is actually two questions. I just noticed that. I don't know how that get past me. There's two question marks. So the first part of the question is, should one be optimistic or realistic about the future? And I mean, to be realistic is probably better. I mean, to be optimistic, that's like being hopeful. I mean, to the extent that being optimistic is being hopeful, hoping for the best, just kind of having faith that things are going to turn out like well. The Buddha did teach that monks should not be hopeful, that hope is a kind of desire for the future. So, I mean, you can give the future the benefit of the doubt, and that's about as optimistic as I would recommend. Or you can be optimistic in the sense of like, whatever happens to me is going to be the fruition of my own karma. Again, we're like seeking equilibrium. Karma is like water. It just kind of seeks its own level, so to speak, in a sense. So it's like whatever happens to you is like what should happen to you. I mean, from a Buddhist point of view, it makes perfect sense. People that don't have much appreciation for Dharma will say, oh, you're victim blaming, this kind of stuff. But really, even if something bad happens to you, it's like paying off a karmic debt, so to speak. So, I mean, that's a kind of optimism you can have that would be valid from a Buddhist point of view. Just bear in mind, whatever happens, everything happens the way it's supposed to happen. That was almost like a mantra for me sometimes. It still comes out sometimes, just spontaneously. Everything happens the way it's supposed to happen, which is kind of optimistic. But, it's with regard to realistic, I mean, that's just sort of being objective. I think it might have been a better choice of words to give the choice between being optimistic or being objective. And you can kind of be both at the same time, so long as you bear in mind, everything is just happens the way it's supposed to happen. And, there's a lot of optimistic things you can say, like, you can say that like, you never get what you're not ready for, that maybe you have some karma that something bad is going to happen to you, but it's like the universe postpones it until you're ripe for it, in a sense, that you're more able to deal with it, which sounds kind of woo-woo and all that, and we shouldn't really dwell on it, but there is that. So getting back to Yatisha's first question, should one be optimistic or realistic about the future? I mean, realistic is probably your best bet, but realistic isn't pessimistic. I mean, realism and optimism are not opposites. The opposite of optimism is pessimism. You shouldn't be pessimistic. I mean, to remind yourself that you're not going to live forever, that you're going to die someday. I mean, that's more realistic than pessimistic. Sort of like a lot of people accuse Buddhism of being pessimistic because, the first noble truth to exist is to suffer. But that's just observing the way things are. So you can have a certain philosophical optimism. Everything happens the way it's supposed to happen. It's the fruition of my own karma, that kind of thing. But aside from that, you're better off just being objective and not like slathering value judgments all over everything. Optimistic is sort of like putting a positive spin on things, and positive and negative have to balance out. So you're better off just leaving like the facts of your existence as unadorned with value judgments as possible. And with regard to Yatisha's second question, should one not think about the future much altogether? I'm pretty sure I already answered that one, more or less. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And if there was another person who asked a question at the end of last week's live stream and the comment just disappeared, because some of the comments did disappear. I remember somebody suggesting that I turn that fan on, and I addressed it in the video. I pointed out that the ceiling fan's already going. So it's not necessary to turn that one on. And then I was looking for it to see who it was that made that suggestion, and it was gone. But I distinctly remember seeing it in the comments, in the chat, and responding to it on the video. So it's just, who knows? It's just weirdness. But getting back to Siovak and Sipad Zirna, his question is, thoughts? And he included a YouTube short video of Slavoj Zizek. I don't know how to pronounce the names. I mean, I understand the Slavoj part because he kind of like sprays when he talks. The Zizek, I'm not sure about. But it's just him discussing like introspection. Slavoj says that, I mean, you shouldn't introspect too much. You shouldn't look inward too much because you're going to find deep shit in there. And so he says, this is actually a quote. He says, the only way to overcome yourself is to identify with the mask, like the public persona. And he also says, this is also a quote from Slavoj, in your complete identification with another, you can find freedom. So it's like you've got like the outward projection of an image. You just identify with that, and that's who you really are, or at least that's who you pretend to really be. And according to Slavoj, that's the best way to go about things. And one thing you should bear in mind with Zizek, I don't know how to pronounce these names, is that he is one of the few communist philosophers that is taken seriously in Western civilization lately, over the past few decades. And I don't know what kind of communist he is. I don't know if he's a Marxist or just sort of like some kind of rehashed neo-Marxist, or if he was just never, he's just not a Marxist at all. I don't know what kind of communist he is. But he does not strike me as a particularly wise individual. Intelligent, sure. But intelligence and wisdom are not the same. And I remember when I first started watching some of his videos, I did watch some of his videos, not because I'm a communist, but just because, they come up on the feed and I was curious just to see what he'd have to say, or he'd be talking with someone who wasn't a communist or whatever. And back just like 10 or so years ago, he was just continually like pulling at his shirt and like rubbing his nose. I mean, he couldn't get a sentence out without like tugging at his shirt and like compulsively, habitually, just like rubbing his nose and pulling on it and this kind of thing, which indicates that he was not being mindful. He's just, his arms are just doing all this nervous stuff without him being like fully in control of it. But he has stopped doing that. I've noticed that he doesn't tug on his shirt or like pull on his nose anymore in the videos where you see him lately. So he has at least like been practiced enough mindfulness to train himself to stop doing that. But I mean, just when he's discouraging introspection, it's like Socrates saying, allegedly, the unexamined life is not worth living. Well, Slavoj would say pretty much the opposite. Just fake it. Just be like this fake persona and identify with that. And that's how you find freedom, according to him. Which, I mean, it kind of makes sense if he's a communist, because communism does not strike me as a particularly wise, like, economic or social system. It just is not in harmony with human nature. The animal instincts of the human animal, which go by the name of human nature. So, yeah, my thoughts on Slavoj is he does not strike me as a wise person. And he just prefers ideas that he comes up with in his head to any kind of empiricism, apparently. I don't know how anyone could still be a communist after over a century at this point of stagnant and failed economies, totalitarianism and occasional genocide. I mean, there's really no excuse for a communist nowadays. Anyways, I'm just going to move on to Slavoj Zizek's second question. He says, do you believe there is a moral development of societies that is objective, or are people and societies over time not any more moral than we were thousands of years ago? And I'm going to check the CPU is at 36%, so that the lag is minimal. Just keeping you updated on the CPU usage. But getting back to Slavoj Zizek, well, I mean, one thing that immediately comes to mind are people and societies over time not any more moral than we were thousands of years ago? Well, think about northern India in the Buddhist time. That was definitely a more morality-based culture than we've got going now. I mean, morals are almost obsolete in Western civilization. Morality, any kind of systematic morality, has been replaced by unrefined feminine sentiment. You know, don't hurt anyone's feelings. Overindulgence in any kind of sensuality is just fine and dandy. That has nothing to do with morals anymore. But getting to the top part of the question, do you believe there is a moral development of societies that is objective? Well, I mean, morality, whether it's objective or not, depends on your definition of morals. So, I mean, you could define morals in a sense that it could be objectively like quantified. Morals, you know, it's like crime rates, that kind of stuff. Then, yeah, you could objectify that. I don't know how you'd have like an objective like measurement or critique of morals in society without like defining it in some way that could then be applied to the data. So let's just say moral development of societies. Gosh, I mean, how would you quantify that? I mean, how would you objectify like the morality of a society with regard to crime rates? You know, like what would be the murder rate and like the rate of like theft, you know, assault, that kind of stuff. But I mean, you don't really have good data for the Ganges Valley 2,500 years ago. So let's see. It seems to me with regard to this that, I mean, you're always going to have this cosmic balance of good and evil, that kind of thing. You know, it's just, if you're living in dualism, which is the way samsara works, you're living in a dualistic world, then opposites tend to balance out. So you've got morality and immorality, they're going to balance out. Regardless of the society, it seems to me. But with regard to, I mean, look at the Buddhist time, you know, Iron Age, northern India, the Ganges Valley, you know, 500 BCE, 2,500 years ago. And you had a lot more saints and sages then. But at the same time, you probably had a lot more sociopaths and like bandits and serial killers and that kind of thing. You know, you read the text, and it was dangerous to go alone, you know, through the forest, because there's bandits, not just tigers and leopards, but bandits. You know, nuns, like Buddhist nuns, were not allowed to live in the forest just because it was too dangerous. And then you had like not only like outlaws, like bandits, but you had like neighboring kings that, I mean, they just invade, you know, plunder, this kind of stuff. Like in the list of dangers that's found in the rules of monastic discipline several times. Like, for example, there are the 10 reasons why it's okay to abbreviate a formal ceremony, like the Patimokkha recitation. You know, it's like the stereotypical list of 10 dangers. Number 1 on the list is kings. And it's, you know, I mean, it could be even your own king who's just sweeping through and just like forcibly recruiting any man of military age to go and fight, or it could be the king next door who's already done that and is now invading. So I do think that nowadays we're living in an age of spiritual or moral mediocrity. There's fewer saints and there's fewer of the opposite of saints. So it's like in the Buddhist time, you had a lot of like wisdom and goodness, and you had a lot of badness and foolishness. And that was pretty much how the balance worked out then. Now it's just sort of like lukewarm mediocrity across the board. And so it all adds up to the same zero. It all balances out to the same zero. Yeah. So, even there are some societies that were just like cruel and ruthless. It's like Huns or Mongols, back in the day when, they were like conquering large areas of territory. They were pretty awful. It's like the Mongols, 13th century, they'd come to a walled town and they would demand immediate surrender. And if they didn't surrender immediately, they would completely destroy that town, just level it to the ground and just leave this big mound of severed heads outside of where the city used to be as a sign, you better do what we say or we're going to fuck you up. And they just seem to have no compassion at all. There was stories of like when the Mongols made it to, I think it was around what nowadays would be Hungary. It's like around the Danube region. They were the townspeople would just flee and hide in the woods, and the Mongols would call them out and say, "Come on, you can just go ahead and go about your business." And then as soon as they had harvested their fields and everything, then they'd all be slaughtered. And the Mongols just thought it was funny. They didn't care. So there is that, although they sort of had other like counterbalancing virtues. Even just like fearlessness and courage, that kind of thing could be considered virtues. But it's, yeah, I don't want to do an entire cultural anthropological survey, but it does seem that you could say that some cultures are more virtuous than others or more moral than others. Seems that way anyway. But overall, it seems to me that the modern, like postmodern world is no more virtuous than the Ganges Valley in the Buddhist time. It's just that we're kind of weak and soft, feminized. And, so, there's less violence, less aggression, not so much because people are restraining themselves, but just because they're just incapable of it anymore. It's kind of, they've degenerated, if you will. So, yeah, I think overall that people are no more happy than they were 2,000 years ago. Overall, no more virtuous than they were 2,000 years ago, except 2,000 years ago, you had more of a broader bell-shaped curve, because now it's just sort of like lukewarm mediocrity is predominant. So I'm just going to move on to Slavoj Zizek's next question. And it does seem that the lag is more or less under control, and I hope I don't sound like I'm talking from the bottom of a well. And I do hope that it's recording. It does seem to be. So, Slavoj Zizek says, would arahants still have an unconscious mind, or do they have a complete understanding of the mind? And this falls into the category of second-guessing the mental states of a fully enlightened being. I get asked these kind of questions fairly frequently. What is it like to be fully enlightened? And even if a fully enlightened person were to explain it to an unenlightened person, the unenlightened person still wouldn't get it. Because, like Bertrand Russell says, when a stupid person hears what an intelligent person says, they have to translate it into something stupid that they can understand. So Bertrand Russell, I think it was in his History of Western Philosophy, he's talking about how he would rather be he would rather have his philosophy described by his most virulent enemy among philosophers than to have it described by some normie who didn't really understand philosophy but was sympathetic to Bertrand Russell. Just because the philosophical enemy is more likely to get the main points correct, even though he disagrees with them, than the normie who just doesn't really understand. And so he has to like take this, sophisticated philosophy and translate it into something stupid so that he can understand it. And I think Bertrand Russell was referring to Xenophon in his biography or his account of Socrates, that he didn't consider Xenophon to be particularly reliable as a source with regard to what Socrates was like, because Xenophon was a normie. According to Bertrand Russell, he was not philosophical. He just kind of dumbed things down in order to understand it better, even though he apparently was a competent general. So let's get back to the question, though, which I've pretty much ignored thus far. Would arahants still have an unconscious mind? I have heard it said that they wouldn't, that when you're fully conscious, that means you're fully conscious, you are fully awake, you are awakened. And so they would no longer have a subconscious mind. They would be aware of all the workings of their mind, theoretically. And the wiser you get, the less subconscious you are. Like getting back to Slavoj Zizek, it was like when he is like tugging on his shirt and rubbing his nose compulsively, 10, 15, 20 years ago. I mean, that was like subconscious. It wasn't fully conscious what he was doing. But then as you become more mindful, or as he became more mindful, he like brought it up into his conscious mind in order to deal with it. And so even if an arahant, a fully enlightened being, from the point of view of some unenlightened psychologist or psychoanalyst, if he still has some kind of subconscious mind, he's going to have a hell of a lot less of it than the average person. You could say that most animals, it's pretty much all they've got is a subconscious mind, other than maybe some really simple, superficial stuff. Most of what they're doing, like instincts, like a bird building a nest, that would be just like subconscious urges. They don't know why they're doing it. They just have this urge to do it, so they just act it out. Sort of like Slavoj tugging at his shirt. So, yeah, it's just another one of those questions of second guessing the mental states of a fully enlightened being. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, Western culture stands apart from the rest of the world in emphasizing the freedom and autonomy of the individual rather than conforming to one's tribe or group. How and why did Western individualism develop in Europe rather than in other parts of the world? And that's a good question. It's kind of an anthropological question, I think. Why is it that individualism just kind of flowered in the West and nowhere else really? And I think there's a possibility it could be genetic. There could just be some genetic quirk in the European ethnicity or family of ethnicities that are just more individualistic, because it's like the Greeks. They weren't as individualistic as we are now, but still they were much more individualistic than, say, the Persians next door, which is one reason why they were able to kick ass on the Persians. And then like the Romans were kind of conservative, but still they allowed more individualism. They had lots of different like religious cults and so forth, different philosophies. You could just pick and choose which one works best for you as a general rule. They were definitely not opposed to innovation. But the thing is, you had Germanic tribes north of the Rhine that also were very individualistic. And it was like after the Roman Empire had pretty much degenerated into a kind of demoralized dictatorship where like individualism wasn't as valued as it was like during the glory days of the Republic. Then you had these Germanic tribes who conquered the collapsing Western Roman Empire and sort of revived these ideals of individual rights and so forth. So that would seem to indicate that the Germanic tribes north of the Rhine, I mean, they didn't inherit that from the Greeks. You know, it just seems like it's a European thing. And Europeans are the most like physically diverse group, at least with regard to appearance. You know, you've got sort of dark, like swarthy European types, very pale European types, different hair colors, different eye colors that, I mean, other ethnicities just don't have that as a general rule. I mean, like they might be like kind of lighter skinned or darker skinned within the range of their own, you know, ethnicity, you know, in the bell-shaped curve and all that, but different eye colors, different hair colors, that's like a European thing. And it's kind of indicates there's more individual variation, not only with regard to appearance, but also with regard to the way people think and behave. So let's see, what's the actual question? How and why did Western individualism develop in Europe rather than in other parts of the world? Yeah, I mean, it could be genetic. It seems like it's either genetic or maybe even like some cultural inheritance from the Indo-Europeans that conquered so much of the Western world. You know, it may have been just some sort of ideal that they brought with them. I'm not sure what kind of individualism you had before the Indo-European expansion into Europe and like northern India and Persia and places like that. I don't know if it'd be interesting just to see like where innovations, like Stone Age innovations came from, like new patterns for making stone arrowheads. I mean, did the Europeans, the cave people of Europe, were they like ahead of the cave people of China or southern India? Or, I mean, I don't know. So that would be interesting. I mean, that would be a step towards answering the question, I guess. I mean, if there was a lot of innovation found primarily in the West that then trickled eastwards and southwards, then, I mean, that would be a good argument for maybe some genetic component that causes Europeans to be more individualistic than other ethnicities historically. And I am happy to say that my coffee is now pretty much cold, so it's not causing me to be all perspiry anymore. So, yeah, I mean, you can only guess with regard to this question, how and why did Western individualism develop in Europe rather than other parts of the world? It would seem to be something about our ethnicity is just less conformist than most other ethnicities. And I do think it's possible that there is a genetic component, but I don't know what it would be. But it seems like, I mean, how else would you explain it? Unless, like I said, it's just something that was introduced as a cultural element from like the Indo-Europeans. So I'm sorry, I really can't answer that question with any degree of certainty. So I'm just going to move on to Romeo's second question, which is a follow-up on the first one. Is Western individualism sustainable over the long haul in terms of ensuring the survival of European people? Wouldn't it seem a less effective group survival strategy compared to cultures that emphasize the group over the individual and are thus more unified? Well, I mean, just look at history. I think it was John Stuart Mill. I was considering getting the quote just so I could read it to you. But John Stuart Mill has this quote. I think it's in his essay on liberty, which is sort of like a classical liberal manifesto written in the 1800s. And he was talking about how, like, the Chinese were living in palaces and wearing silk when our ancestors in Europe were still wearing animal skins and just living in like huts. But due to their adherence to conformity and lack of imagination and Western individualism, it's like the Europeans conquered the world. And even if they didn't conquer the entire world militarily, although they came pretty damn close during the colonial era, still, I mean, you go to communist China, I mean, the communism they derived from Europe, you know, the economics and the political ideas that they're following originally came from Europe. You know, you look at Chinese people, they're wearing Western style clothing. They have Western style hairdos. They've got Western technology. And the only way they can even come close to rivaling us with regard to technology is just by spying and stealing Western ideas. So Western individualism thus far has been much more successful over the long haul in terms of ensuring the survival of European people. It's not so much individualism that is causing Western civilization to go into decline. It's just good times make weak men make bad times. You know, like I was saying, that we're in a state of like lukewarm, like mediocrity. I mean, we are definitely decadent. And it's because we were so successful, we got soft and weak and lazy. It's like Theodore Roosevelt had this famous quote that I saw on X a few days ago. It's the curse of all civilizations, all great civilizations, that the men eventually become unable to fight just because of materialism and luxury and security just makes them soft and weak and lazy, and they cannot stand up to uncouth barbarians that sweep across the border. In fact, nowadays, a lot of them are just inviting the barbarians in. Come on, sweethearts. Stay in this luxury hotel. We'll provide for you. So the individualism, I think, has made Western civilization just predominant on this planet. It's just that there are other factors, you know, like moral decline, that are more dangerous to us than individualism. I mean, it is good to have enough like conformity that everyone is pretty much on the same page, or most people in the country share the same worldview to some degree, or at least the same ideals. You know, civic nationalism is what kept America strong for more than 200 years. But when you get so much individualism, I mean, no, I don't know if you can even call it individualism, where people are just like splintering and it's becoming like tribalistic and so forth. That's not so much individualism. That's just conforming to a smaller group. I mean, people are, they're a social animal. People have got the herd instinct. So, yeah, it may be that Europeans have a little bit less herd instinct than most humans. But I think I answered that question. Yeah, I don't think that it's a less effective group survival strategy compared to cultures that emphasize the group over the individual, because the cultures that emphasize the group over the individual are conformist, and they tend not to have much imagination. They do not dare to deviate from what everyone else is thinking and doing. And that's why the Europeans, with their sort of liberal ideals and individualism and so forth, that, I mean, the Greeks had it to some degree, the Romans, the Germanic tribes. It just seems like a European thing, not like specifically owed to any region of Europe. So, yeah, I think, a certain amount of conformity is necessary just to hold the society together so it doesn't just fly apart in all directions. But still, a society that has like individuality, like individual rights and so forth, is going to be stronger as a general rule, all else being equal, than people that are just conformists. That's one reason why the Greeks were able to defeat the Persians in battle, because the Persians, they were essentially, to some degree, you could say that they're like slaves to the king, and it's like they just followed the rules. That's one reason why Alexander the Great was able to conquer Persia as easily as he did with relatively few soldiers, because the Persians were so predictable. They fought in the same way. It's like you read Xenophon's Anabasis, where he's talking about the march of the 10,000 through Persian territory. And the Greeks realized it's the Persians, they always tie up their horses outside the camp at night. They just don't fight at night. It's just, they didn't think about it. Why would anyone fight at night? So they didn't even prepare. And they just left their horses outside the camp. So the Greeks just went in and helped themselves to the Persian horses. Suddenly they got cavalry. And they were able to fight their way all the way back to Greece. And I assume that Alexander was familiar with this book and got a lot of inspiration from it. It's, without individualism and individual thought, you're going to have a lot fewer ideas and a lot less innovation and a lot less improvement. But I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from Nijbik. It's NJBK. Nijbik. And Nijbik says, have you ever met any arahants? Do you think you could identify them as such if you met them? Are there any monks today whom you think are arahants? Well, that's 3 questions, isn't it? I got to divide this up. So we got a few more questions than I thought we did, just because I failed to divide them up before starting this video. So, have I ever met any arahants? I don't know. How could you possibly know? But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Sometimes you see this wise old monk who lives alone out in a cemetery or something, and the villagers around consider him to be an arahant. But that's no proof. He could just be putting on a show, identifying with the image like Slavoj Zizek was advising. And just because you have a reputation for being enlightened doesn't mean anything, because I had a reputation for being enlightened in certain areas of Burma. So, have I met any arahants? Maybe. But again, I think an arahant would be a kind of paradox, because escaping or transcending samsara within a samsaric context doesn't necessarily mean anything. Meaning is samsaric. So anyone who transcends meaning, it just becomes meaningless. So I am somewhat skeptical that full enlightenment is even a thing in a samsaric context. And like I mentioned relatively recently in a Q&A, that there was a school called the Yogacara Logicians, or the Dignaga school, which was a medieval Buddhist school that specialized in logic. And their classic example of a problematic premise is that such and such person is fully enlightened. There's no way you can prove it. The fully enlightened being might know that they're fully enlightened, but they can't prove it to anybody else. If you got psychic powers, you could display those, but just because you have psychic powers doesn't mean that you're enlightened. So maybe, my best bet at an arahant, I did meet Shui Umin Seattle, who had a reputation for being very wise. Met a few other Seattles that seemed wise, but you can't really tell. How could you know? According to the text, only an arahant would know if another arahant was enlightened, and even then maybe not. Like if you're a dry visioned arahant who doesn't have any psychic powers, you can't look into the mind of the other being, how are you going to know? So, with regard to have I ever met any arahants? Maybe, if that even means anything within the context of samsara. So, Nijbik's second question, do you think you could identify them as such if you met them? And I've pretty much already answered that question. It's like, how? I mean, you couldn't really know. I mean, if you were another arahant, maybe. But if you're not an arahant, how are you going to know? I mean, sometimes you could see that they aren't arahants. You know, if they're just like, you know, screaming drunk and like picking fights and this kind of stuff, they're like stealing and lying. I mean, that would be a fairly good indication that, you know, they're involved in sex scandals and this kind of stuff. Fairly good indication that they're not fully enlightened. But who knows? I mean, if full enlightenment doesn't even mean anything, or maybe somebody like J. Krishnamurti is right about being enlightened, where, I mean, you're not like enslaved to morals if you're fully enlightened, which means you're like liberated. I mean, how are you even going to define enlightenment in a case like that, where there's like this whole spectrum? Like Theravada Buddhism is at one extreme end of the spectrum with regard to what an enlightened being is like. Theravada Buddhism insists, Orthodox Theravada insists that in order to have purity of mind, in order to become enlightened, you have to have purity of mind. And before you can have purity of mind, you have to have purity of morals, which means you have to have perfected morality, which means you are a saint before you can become a sage, like an enlightened sage. At the other end, you got people like Paul Lowe or J. Krishnamurti or maybe U.G. Krishnamurti, where it's like anything goes. There's no rules. If you're enlightened, you're no longer like subject to these limitations. You can, I mean, whatever. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know how an unenlightened person could possibly identify an arahant, even if they meet them, even if you're sitting in the same room with them. You know, it's like you got a fool in the same room as an arahant. The fool is going to be looking at the arahant through foolishness-colored glasses. And they're just going to be this, maybe even scoffing and sneering. Maybe the arahant has some physical peculiarity, or he speaks with an accent or something, and the other person just might be mocking him because of this. So, I mean, there are people in the Buddhist time who despised the Buddha. And they didn't know he was enlightened. They thought it was all bullshit. People are like that. So I think I'll just move on to Nijbik's third question. Are there any monks today whom you think are arahants? I have no idea. I mean, like I said, I met Shui Uminseattle, but he has passed away. He is no longer alive. And of the monks that I have known, I really have no idea. I mean, it's possible, but I have no idea. So, I mean, who today? I mean, there are people that have a reputation for being arahants. Eckhart Tolle, for example. He has a reputation for being enlightened. There are quite a few of those kind of people. There was Andrew Cohen, he had quite a following back around the time that I became a monk, around 1990. You know, he was luring people away from Vipassana, and it was like just lots of people were following Andrew Cohen. I think his teacher was Harilal Punja in India. And Andrew Cohen he didn't deny that he was enlightened or considered himself to be enlightened until finally his own disciples started pointing out to him, man, you're not acting like an enlightened being. I don't remember what the scandal was. It could have been some kind of sex thing. I don't know. I didn't really keep up with it. But eventually, he came to the conclusion, well, golly, I'm not really an arahant after all. And then, of course, you've got Daniel Ingram. There's a lot of people like that in the West. Probably a lot of people like that in the East, too, who claim to be fully enlightened and maybe are just, like, in some cases, just overestimating their own attainments. So from the point of view of monastic discipline, if a monk overestimates his own attainments, he thinks he's enlightened, and he says he's enlightened, even though he isn't, he's not parajiki, he's not excommunicated because he was sincere. He just overestimated his own attainments. Whereas a monk who knows that he's not enlightened and says that he is, then he's excommunicated for the rest of his life. He's committed a parajika offense. The worst thing a monk can do is to deliberately lie about having attained superhuman mental states, which includes enlightenment itself. So, assuming that being fully enlightened even means anything in a samsaric context, all meaning is samsaric, then maybe there could be enlightened monks. That wouldn't surprise me. Assuming that it's possible, I'm assuming that there are fully enlightened monks out there, and in a lot of cases, they would just be hermits, just humbly living alone out in the woods. And, maybe the local villagers who are putting food in their bowl, consider them to be fully enlightened, but nobody else knows about them. They're not famous. I remember one time, there was a monk, what was his name? It was Bodhi bin Ein Seattle or something like that. And he was considered to be fully enlightened. And some of his supporters very much wanted me to meet him. So they drive me to Bodhi Ein bin, I can't remember the name of him. It was Bodhi Ein Seattle, something like that. And so as we're going there, they're very keen on me meeting this arahant. And I asked the driver, are you sure he's enlightened? The driver said, yeah, I'm sure. Yep, he's enlightened, all right. Although there's no way the driver could have possibly known if he was really enlightened or not. So we get there, and the place is like a circus. There's like pagodas and statues and everything being erected all over the place. It's sort of like a Buddhist amusement park or something. And you've got, there's like alchemists wearing the white robes and the long beard and the beads and just, it's just like this spiritual, it's like a Buddhist Kumbh Mela or something going on there. And I remember everyone's waiting for the arahant to come out to eat his meal. And he doesn't come out to eat until it's like 11:45. So there's no way he's going to be finished by midday, so that he's going to be breaking a rule, which, it's neither here nor there, I guess. But he comes out, it's like 11:45 a.m., sits down to eat his meal. One of the first thing he does is he blows his nose into his hand and then just wipes the snot on the wall next to him. And it's like, people think this person is enlightened? Who knows? Maybe he was, and he was just sort of like the Krishnamurti kind of enlightened being. The Osho kind of enlightened being, It's like, who knows? Maybe they're right, and an arahant can behave in really weird ways. But, I can't really name any famous monk or even a non-famous one, or even like a Hindu Swami or anything like that. I really, if I had to guess, who is an enlightened being nowadays, if I had to name one enlightened being, or at least my best guess, I'd be at a loss. I don't know who it would be. Eckhart Tolle, maybe. But he's a layperson. But I'm not really familiar with who the famous monks are nowadays. And those that are famous enough that I know about them, they may be wise. They may be good people, virtuous, wise people. But fully enlightened, I just have seen no evidence to support that. Although who knows exactly what the evidence would be. And I suppose I should just move on to the next question. This is from King Kung. And King Kung says, did you have any physical altercations in your monk life? And do you do any wilderness stuff now? Also, oh, this is 3 questions again. Okay. So I got to separate the 3 questions. It is good that people are limiting themselves to 3 questions. That is commendable. So you get merit for that. King Kung's first question: did you have any physical altercations in your monk life? And if you read my latest book, Memoirs from Myanmar, I'm pretty sure there's a chapter in there. It's like the one time I assaulted another monk. I had one serious physical altercation as a monk. And that was, I mean, I don't want to give the whole story. I mean, it would take half an hour at least to give you all the relevant details. But there was this Burmese monk who tried to just move in and take over the monastery where I was senior monk at the time. And he obviously just did not follow the rules of monastic discipline. He was obviously a rascal and a troublemaker. And I just told him he wasn't going to stay there. That he was going to have to leave. He was like a visiting monk who just decided he was going to take over and become the abbot there. And I mean, the way the final altercation occurred is I just made up my mind that he was going to have to go. He was like a cousin or something of the other monk who lived at the monastery. There were only 2 of us at the time. There was me and there was old Unandia. And I mean, I wanted to kick him out before then. And I went up to Unandia and said, that new monk wants to stay here, but I don't want to let him stay here. I want to kick him out. And then Unandia looks up at me and says, he is my brother. But the Burmese, especially Burmese village culture, they'll call someone their brother when they're not really their brother. And there was probably at least 30 years difference in age between these 2. But we did have a kind of agreement that if some new monk was going to stay at the monastery, both of us had to agree. If I agreed but he didn't, the person couldn't stay. If he agreed but I didn't, the person couldn't stay. And I was just finally made up my mind. I'd seen enough of his rule breaking and so forth that even if old Unandia didn't like it, I was going to kick him out anyway. So I go down to have it out with this visiting monk, and he's sitting there like out in this clearing at the monastery reading a book. And I go to Unandia, who is hard of hearing, so I had to yell in order for him to hear me. And he said that I said to him, that new monk wants to stay here. I don't want to let him stay here. I'm going to kick him out. And Unandia looks up at me and he just gives me this delighted grin because apparently he didn't like him either, even though they were like relatives, like cousins or something. And so he said, is he here? And I said, yeah, he's just right out there reading a book. So I went out to him and asked him, did you hear what I just said to Unandia? And he kind of looked up at me and says, no, which probably wasn't true because I was yelling to this half-deaf old monk like 30 feet away. So I told him that he was going to have to go. And this visiting monk just said, I'm staying. And what he was doing is he's like pretending to still read the book. He's pretending like he's already the abbot. I'm just this, troublemaking foreigner who's just a visitor there or something. So that was one of his mistakes, was not looking at me. Because he's just like pretending to still read the book, and I'd say, no, you're really going to have to go. And I'm staying. And then I tell him, if you don't go, I'm going to have to throw you out myself. And he's like, no, you won't. And he's not looking at me. And if he was looking at me, he would see that I was starting to get kind of worked up. In fact, I even kind of started to lunge at him a couple of times. I'm practically vibrating at this point. Because he really was a troublemaker. I'm leaving out all the stuff that happened before this. And so he's just saying, no, you won't. You're not gonna kick me out. And so finally, he just says, like, this is my place now. You are just a visitor. Now go. He wasn't even like looking at me. He's like pretending to still read the book. He just kind of, now go. you know, and that was it. It was like I snapped, and the physical altercation lasted maybe half a second, because all I did, I just lunged at him, grabbed him by the front of his robes, and just slammed him to the ground like an enraged gorilla. And then I kind of leaned over and said, "You are the visitor," and then stomped off to fill a bucket of water at the well. And it was like maybe 60 feet away. I turned around and looked, and he was still lying on his side on the ground. I was told he had a lump on his head from where his head hit the ground. But it was like the whole altercation, the whole physical contact lasted about half a second. And the next day he was being belligerent. You know, he was just like, he was following me around the monastery, like clapping his hands, trying to make me like jump, you know, trying to startle me or something. And I'm just like thinking, how am I going to get rid of him? Am I really going to have to beat him up in order to get rid of him? And it's like, I'm like pacing back and forth in my cave, like a caged leopard, just, you know, not knowing what to do really. You know, so I'm just these crazy ideas coming up. Like I could like get him into a double hammerlock and fling him into the river, but his arms might dislocate and he might drown or something. You know, it's like, what am I going to do? And then finally it dawned on me, the obvious solution, just appeal to the villagers, my supporters, you know, just when I go for alms round the next morning, all I got to do, my people, my friends, I need your help. There's this visiting monk who refuses to leave and he's causing all kinds of trouble. And so I did that the next day, and there's all these appreciative gasps from the village ladies, you know, hearing about what's going on. And a few of them came up to me and said, "Don't worry, we're going to go tell the village headman about this." And so within a short time, the two village headmen from the two villages came, and there was a bunch of sort of like village elders showed up. And also there was a few like young bucks, you know, young village guys, just in case any manhandling was required. And they just said, "Don't worry about anything. We'll get rid of him for you." And after that, I was just like cackling, like, how could it be this easy? You know? And that they did. They just I asked if you want me to come down to the lower monastery with you and help participate in this. And they said, "No, you just stay right here. We'll take care of it." And they just essentially perp walked him out of the monastery. And so that was gratifying. Once I realized that all I had to do was just appeal to the village, because I mean, the villagers, they really supported me a lot. You know, they were kind of proud that you had this Western man. You know, it's like, according to Burmese villagers, in their opinion, America is like paradise. You know, everyone's rich and beautiful and happy and Christian. And I renounced all of that in order to live in poverty and follow their religion at a more sincere level than they were following it. And so they felt vindicated and proud that they had this serious Western monk living near their village, and they were getting all kinds of merit by offering alms food to me in the mornings and this kind of thing. And so, yeah, it was pretty easy to get rid of him once I realized what I had to do. But I had already assaulted him once before that came to pass. And that was really the only time I really got physical with another monk. There was a few other monks that I had some like heated disagreements with, but there was one old monk, Umakuta, who, I don't know even why he was a monk. He became a monk. He was a farmer who became a monk in his old age, and he's just continued farming. You know, he's raising chickens and, you know, growing crops out in front of his cabin and all this. And one time he snuck down to the area of my cave where the only bamboo at the monastery was growing in order to cut some bamboo. And I just went down and just grabbed the machete out of his hands and just drove him away, just yelling at him to, you know, go away. I had to give the machete back, but when you're like a serious monk, I mean, at a time like that, you know, I'm a foreigner living in just this strange land of people that just don't speak my language and don't think like me, don't look like me. And I'm like trying to practice Dhamma at a relatively intensive level so that you become sort of like an emotional pressure cooker. You become like a hysterical basket case, going with Freudian language. This hysteria is caused by like repressed urges and so forth. And a seriously practicing monk or nun is going to have more repressed urges than Joe Blow, living in suburbia. So, I mean, there's always the possibility of stuff like that happening. I've had a few friends. There was one Australian monk I knew who said that he was chased around the monastery by a monk with a machete once. I think he was a Thai monk, chasing him around the monastery in Thailand with a machete. Although the Australian monk said that he could tell by the look in his eyes he wasn't really going to hack him or anything. So, I mean, that kind of stuff does happen. But in my case, there was only that one altercation where I slammed some troublemaking visiting monk who refused to leave, just grabbed him and slammed him to the ground. But if you want to read the full story, it's in my most recent book, which can be ordered on Amazon. The link is below in the comments. Now that I'm shamelessly plugging my own book. So anyways, King Kung's second question. Do you do any wilderness stuff now? And I'm sorry to say that I don't. Before I was a monk, I did a lot of backpacking. I lived in the Pacific Northwest, which is like ecotopia. Like in Washington State, there's a number. I mean, I grew up just below the southern boundary of Olympic National Park. Miles and miles of hiking trails. Elk and deer and bears and all this kind of stuff. And then when I moved to Bellingham, it wasn't very far away from the Pasayten Wilderness area, which is like one of the wildest areas in Washington State. Pretty much the only area that still had grizzly bears and gray wolves and caribou and moose, porcupines. So I did a lot of backpacking. And then as a monk in Burma, I was pretty much camping all the time. I'd spent a lot of time out in relatively wild, remote areas as a monk. But then coming back to America, especially coming to South Carolina, I had this idea of hiking to the top of Paris Mountain on the outskirts of Greenville. I haven't even done that. I've done almost no hiking at all. Just go for a few little walks with my sweetheart, just walk through a park. And we don't do that very much even. Especially now that we don't live near Paris Mountain. So that's kind of unfortunate. It might be not until I retire that I'll really start like going on camping trips again. But who knows? I mean, I wouldn't even know the good places to hike or camp in South Carolina. So yeah, there is that. And finally, the third question from King Kung. How are your snails doing? Well, depends on which snails. That tank that's in moonlight mode back there, I'll harvest ram's horn snails out of the pond and put them in there, but they don't last very long because there are loaches, zebra loaches, Botia striata in there that specialize in eating snails. And so when I put snails in there, they eat algae and detritus for probably less than 48 hours before they get found by a zebra loach that then feeds on them. On the other hand, I've got another aquarium over there, that little 10-gallon there. Put this back. I mean, I really should do an aquarium video. But there's like a population explosion of snails in that 10-gallon tank because there were some fish that died in there. And they just kind of disappear into the plants and everything. I don't see them as a general rule. And then the snails feed on them, and it just causes this population explosion of snails. You can also take like an algae wafer and put that in there, for feeding like algae eating fish and so forth. Put that in there, and it causes a population explosion of snails too. And my wife, there's an aquarium, little fish tank, like right off camera, right to my right, that has got these little freshwater pufferfish in it, then they also feed on snails. So there's no snails in that tank either, or not very many. And then I've got a big fish pond out in back that's just loaded with snails. So the most prosperous snails I've got are the ones out in the fish pond. Lots of them out there. So let's see. Oh, I should also mention that the 10-gallon tank over there, there's a great big mystery snail in there called Righteous Fist of Heroic Effort, who is by far the largest snail I've got. Let's see, how do I set this thing? I think I might have. How do I do this? It was so easy the first time. Oh, I think I know what happened. One moment, please. Okay, I think I'll stop detaching the camera to show the 10-gallon tank. So, enough of snails. Enough of gastropod mollusks, if you will. So, let's see here. I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Fred. And Fred says, just a minute. Continually having to wipe my eyes because if I don't take a shower or wash my face thoroughly at least once every 24 hours, then it's like the skin oil from my eyelids gets into my eyes and starts burning. And it's not even funny. So just excuse me, I'm going to go take a shower for half an hour. I'll be right back. Or not. Let's see here. Next question is from Fred. Fred says, is deep trance near Nibbana? And it is kind of interesting that in some Upanishads, which are not Buddhist texts, but they come pretty close to Buddhism, some of them do, that it talks about how you've got the three states of consciousness for a normal person, which is just waking consciousness, dreaming sleep, and dreamless sleep. And according to at least one of these Upanishads, dreamless sleep comes closest to like enlightenment or Brahman. And I just don't see it that way. I mean, deep trance in which you're like oblivious to everything around you, I don't see how that would be a state of super consciousness. I don't see how you're more awake. You know, a fully enlightened being is awakened. So I don't see how being fully awake is comparable to being completely unconscious. And even Theravada Buddhist monks, like I spent a few months at Pandita Rama, and Mahasi Upandita was giving a Dhamma talk in which he said, Nibbana is like a dreamless sleep. And it's like, how the hell is being fully awake like being asleep? How is being awakened? How is being fully conscious similar to being completely asleep? I just don't see it that way. I think that Nibbana is just like pure consciousness. So, I mean, if a deep trance is somehow more conscious than waking consciousness, then maybe. But personally, I just don't see it that way. I don't see how, I mean, Nibbana would transcend all the different worldly samsaric states. You know, there'd be like enlightenment present in any of the three mental states of the normal person. You know, waking, dreaming sleep, and dreamless sleep. What would be the mental states of a fully enlightened being who is sound asleep? Would there still be this consciousness that is sort of observing the sleep? I think it's possible. But again, second guessing the mental states of an enlightened being is a no-no. Or at least it's just futility of futilities. Vanity of vanities. So personally, I do not think that a deep trance is necessarily near Nibbana, especially if it's like a hypnotic trance where you're just oblivious to everything except the voice of the hypnotist, that kind of thing. I remember one time my father, who was a hypnotist, hypnotized my little brother. And my little brother is just like in a trance in my father's lap. And then my father just claps his hands really loud right next to my brother's ear. He was just oblivious. So, I mean, how is that a superconscious state? I do not see it that way. Although apparently some Hindus might agree with Fred in the idea that a deep trance is near Nibbana. I mean, going with Orthodox Theravada, fourth jhana is, I mean, at least in some suttas, you get the idea that ancient Indian Buddhists, some of them considered fourth jhana to be a kind of jumping off point into Nibbana. You know, like when the Buddha died, he went into parinibbana from fourth jhana. So what is fourth jhana? I mean, is fourth jhana a deep trance? A lot of people seem to think so. A lot of people think in fourth jhana, you become like a hibernating squirrel where you almost stop breathing and your pulse rate almost stops. Like your heart slows down so much that, you know, it's almost undetectable, that kind of thing. But how is being fully awakened similar to being completely oblivious to one's surroundings like a hibernating squirrel? So fourth jhana, in my opinion, is a state of heightened consciousness. Even though you might be sitting cross-legged with your eyes closed, you're not oblivious to everything around you. You'd be in a state of heightened awareness, even though you might look like you're in a trance because you're just sitting there with your eyes closed, not moving. Or it's possible, for all I know, you could be in a heightened state of awareness while at the same time your body is like a hibernating squirrel. I don't see how that would be possible, but just because I don't see how it's possible doesn't mean that it's impossible. So, in answer to Fred's question, is deep trance near Nibbana? Depends on the trance, I suppose. But as a general rule, I would say no. I would say a state of heightened awareness, like someone who's racing a motorcycle or rock climbing on a vertical cliff face might be closer to Nibbana than somebody in a deep, like a hypnotic trance, because you are in a state of heightened awareness. So, I'm just going to move on to Fred's second question. Is samsara and Nibbana a duality? Well, from a samsaric point of view, it is, because samsara is dualistic. And so Nibbana is just an idea in samsara, and samsara is just an idea in samsara, and they're sort of like practically opposites. I do not consider Nibbana and samsara to be opposites. You know, some schools of Mahayana Buddhism say that samsara and Nibbana are ultimately the same, and I can appreciate the sophistication of that idea. I do not think samsara and Nibbana are opposites, but from the point of view of a lot of people, samsara and Nibbana, it's like this duality. It's like yin and yang. If you want to deal with like Nibbana as it really is, then it's not the opposite of anything, because there are no opposites in Nibbana. You know, opposites are found only in samsara, and Nibbana is off the samsaric scale. So, in answer to that question, is samsara and Nibbana a duality? Within the context of samsara, where samsara and Nibbana are both concepts, then in many cases, yes. But in reality, I think not. And so I'm going to move on to Fred's third question. How many questions more so I don't get in a pickle? That's it. That was your third question. So you don't get to ask any more. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Visser. And it seems that my live stream caused a number of new people to ask questions, which is good. I suppose maybe that's another good reason to do it more live streams. I'm not exactly sure why more people watch live streams. I guess some people just want to watch something live and just click on the live stream thing and my video came up. My live stream one. Which isn't going to happen this time because this is going to be pre-recorded, isn't it? Anyhow, Visser says, I have a question that is simple and very likely has asked before, but the question is, how does a monk keep his head bald? This is just one question. The thought process that led me to this question equals, does the monk do it himself, and is the monk allowed to possess a razor alongside his bowl? Well, how does a monk keep his head bald? Either he shaves it himself or another person shaves it, usually another monk. So, the 8 requisites of a monk. Every monk is supposed to have 8 requisites. There's like a sort of like an unofficial 9th requisite too, which is the sitting cloth. But the 8 requisites of a monk are 3 robes, a belt for holding up the lower robe, the alms bowl, a water strainer, a needle for mending his robes, and a razor. So every monk has to have a razor. At your ordination ceremony, at any monk's ordination ceremony, he's supposed to have all 8 requisites, plus the unofficial 9th requisite of the sitting cloth, right there. And if he doesn't have it, his preceptor is supposed to make sure, help him to obtain these things before his ordination. So every monk is supposed to own a razor, and I used a single blade Schick injector, which is the best razor I ever found for shaving my head. It has to be single blade though, because if you go a week without shaving your head and you use one of those double blades, or now it's like up to like 5 or 6 blades on some of these disposable razor things, it just plugs up with hair. You get about an inch and it's all plugged up, and then you got to like unplug it with your thumb or swish it around in water or something. It just doesn't work very well. I just noticed he's got parentheses. He's got the first parenthesis, and then he doesn't end the parentheses. So it's still going. After his question is over, the parenthetical expressions just continue. So in my case, I'm usually shaved my own head. It's like one of the first sentences I learned how to say in Burmese was Depido dinate gong yet jimade shimpia, which was, I would say that to Uzanenda, who was like the designated head shaver at the monastery where I was ordained. So he just took upon himself, he'd shave anybody's head if they wanted their head shaved. All you had to do was just go up to him and say, Depido dinate gong yet jimade shimpia, which means, today I want to get my head shaved, venerable sir. So, yeah. Sometimes the monk shaves his own head, and sometimes somebody else will shave his head, especially if you're in Burma and you've just got like a straight razor. I never dared to shave myself with a straight razor. I just assumed I'd probably like gash myself trying to shave with a straight razor. So yeah, I had the single bladed Schick injector, which I still have. I shaved with it just a couple days ago. It's still good. And anyone who wants to shave your head, maybe you know of a better one, but a single bladed Schick injector is you really don't go wrong with that one. So let's see here. I might as well add that according to the rules of monastic discipline, a monk is required to shave his head and face at least once every 2 months or 2 finger widths, whichever comes first. And so you can look like a sailor. You can have a beard, longer than mine as a monk and not be breaking any rules. But in Buddhist Asia, it's just the tradition, as a general rule, that you get your head shaved and your face like once a week. It's like some monasteries, it's like Thursday is head shaving day. And some monks, like Southeast Asian monks, don't have a lot of facial hair. And so they'll just use tweezers to pull out the few hairs that they've got, which is against the rules of monastic discipline. You have to shave it and not pluck it. On the other hand, Jain monks have to pluck it. Like in the story of Mahavira renouncing the world, if I remember correctly, he pulled out his hair and beard in 5 handfuls when he renounced the world. Which probably hurt like hell, but he didn't care. So, let's just move on, shall we? Next question is from Master Poe. We've been going at it for a little over an hour and a half, although I've been going at it for probably more than 2 hours due to like 3 false starts, just trying to get the lag to not lag. And we seem to be doing pretty good. The CPU is at 34% capacity. And I don't think it starts really lagging until like 50%. So I think we're doing okay. Master Poe says, was Nagarjuna, or actually he's got Naraganjana. Was Naraganjana a real person? And I assume he means Nagarjuna, because I've never heard of Naraganjana. So I assume Master Poe is saying, was Nagarjuna a real person? And from a Buddhist point of view, nobody is a real person. There is no self. Nobody is ultimately real. There is no ultimately real, essential, self-existent individuality. So from the Buddhist point of view, nobody was a real person. Gautama Buddha was not a real person. I am not a real person. You are not a real person. But let's just go with worldly speech, Vohara Desana, within a samsaric context, like was Nagarjuna a historical real person, then it seems pretty likely. I mean, the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka is considered to be like his most essential work. That's sort of like central to his philosophy. It gave rise to Madhyamaka philosophy. I mean, it had to have an author. Presumably, somebody had to write it, and it was attributed to Nagarjuna. But just because a work is attributed to Nagarjuna or to anybody in particular doesn't mean that they really wrote it. Like most Mahayana texts are attributed to Buddha, but it's hardly likely that very many of them really were spoken or taught by the Buddha. And there are quite a few texts that are attributed to Nagarjuna that most scholars would say, no, that's not true. Like there's some Shastra that's attributed to, it's the Prajna Paramita Shastra, I think, that is attributed to Nagarjuna. And there is an editor or a commentator on the book, K. Venkata Ramanan, I think is his name, who said that Nagarjuna may have had a disciple who was also named Nagarjuna, who was the author of that book. Or it could just be that it's just falsely attributed to Nagarjuna. Like the Awakening of Faith Shastra. I think it's a Shastra, the Awakening of Faith. It's a famous Mahayana text. It's attributed to Ajvaghosha, although in all likelihood, it wasn't really composed by Ajvaghosha, because the book that I read claims that the Awakening of Faith Shastra was originally composed in Chinese and then like afterwards kind of retconned and translated back into Sanskrit. Or the Sutra of Huineng is attributed to Huineng, but in all likelihood, based on a book that I read, the editorial notes of a translation by a guy named Yampolsky, that in all likelihood, the Sutra of Huineng was not really authored by Huineng, but was authored by a disciple of Huineng with a name like, what was it? Ning Shui or something like that. So Nagarjuna was in all likelihood a real person, although every text attributed to him probably is not really composed by him. The Mula Madhyamaka Karaka is generally considered to be authentic. Some of his letters, I think he had some devotional verses, but most of what traditionally is attributed to Nagarjuna is a kind of forgery. So if we are real people, Nagarjuna probably also was a real person. I mean, he has somewhat of a biography. I think he was like South Indian, Maybe I think he was supposed to be like a Brahmin from South India, or maybe I'm just confusing that with Bodhidharma. But he did teach at Nalanda University, and I think he did spend a lot of time. His monastery, when he wasn't teaching at Nalanda, was in like the southern half of India. Anyways, I probably should have worn the fez, the Majamaka fez, but too late now. And the next question is from RPAD or RPAD. And RPAD or RPAD says, you mentioned that monks are allowed to kill in self-defense. Do mosquitoes count? I wouldn't even think of slapping them if they didn't make a purpose of attacking me, and considering the diseases they tend, carry, and spread, a mosquito's bite could be fatal. Yeah, well, I mean, I've said before that the most dangerous animal in the forest is not a tiger, it's not wild pigs, it's not leopards, it's not even humans, it is the Anopheles mosquito. But I don't think I really did mention that monks are allowed to kill in self-defense. A monk is allowed to strike out in self-defense, but a monk isn't allowed to deliberately kill even in self-defense. I mean, he can do whatever, a monk can be like Kyle Rittenhouse and just do what is necessary to eliminate the threat. So it may be that a monk is defending himself and striking out in self-defense, and then inadvertently, without the conscious intention to kill his attacker, winds up killing his attacker, and then he would not be guilty of a parajika offense. But if he's deliberately trying to kill his attacker, then he's still culpable and has committed a parajika offense and is excommunicated for the rest of his life. Excommunicated from full ordination in the Sangha. He can no longer be a bhikkhu. And so, do mosquitoes count? Technically, you could strike out in self-defense, but it doesn't take much intelligence to realize that striking a mosquito generally kills it. So, it is kind of ironic that I really didn't start slapping mosquitoes until I was just going full blast as a monk, just living under a rock ledge at the northern boundary of Alaundo Kathapa National Park. There was one year, I went almost the entire year without entering a building, without going under a roof. And mosquitoes, at first, I could endure. I was taking malaria medication, which didn't work very well. I always got malaria anyway. But the mosquito bites, I could kind of endure. I didn't like it, but still it was tolerable. But there was like these, I call them vampire flies. I think it's like a sand fly. It's not as big as a horse fly, but it's bigger than the little black deer flies. They get like an inch long. And when they bite, they're like biting chunks out of you. It hurts. And I just could not sit there with saintly, like bovine equanimity and just be bitten by like horse flies and these vampire flies. And so eventually I started like swatting them with my sweat wiping rag, is the absolutely necessary sweat wiping rag of a Western monk in Southeast Asia. It was just like a washcloth, and use it for all kinds of things. You use it for drying yourself off. When your head is shaved, it doesn't take much cloth, it doesn't take much of a towel to dry you off after you bathe. And also it's for wiping sweat, and also it's just as a flail to keep like the blood-sucking insects from settling on you. And these little vampire flies, as I call them, I think they're some kind of sand fly. They are hard to kill. You can smack them, even desiring to squish them, and they just fly away. And then they just come right back again because they're very determined. They're like little terminators. But I got really good at it. I just eventually got too good at slapping these vampire flies, so that the trick is, you got one on the side of your arm here. You swat from the other side so that the tip of the rag just has like a whiplash effect and really smacks it. And they would be stunned or dead. And then I would try to compensate for the demerit of deliberately killing an insect, or at least deliberately causing grievous harm to this insect, even though it was a blood-sucking parasite, by feeding it to an antlion. There are like antlion pits under this rock ledge where I lived. And those of you who don't know what antlions are, it's a kind of insect that has like this funnel-shaped pit that it digs into loose sand, and anything that falls into it, like an ant, they'll like start throwing little bits of sand at it to knock it down to the bottom, and it's got these big pinchers that grab it and pull it under the ground and eat it once it gets to the bottom of the pit. So I would compensate by feeding a poor hungry little antlion if I did manage to kill one of these creatures. But, in a case like that, where, I guess it was Ajahn Chah berated some monk for slapping a mosquito. It was like, is one drop of your blood so valuable that you will kill a living being? But, a mosquito, what kind of consciousness do they have, really? I doubt that a mosquito is any more conscious than, a paramecium or a plant. They will act they will react. A swatting hand, they might fly away, but it's just like automatic reflexes, sort of like the automatic door at a grocery store. I don't know if they even have really a brain. And they don't feel pain. I'm pretty sure that arthropods, like all insects, crustaceans, and so forth, I really don't think that they feel pain. So I eventually, because I'm living out there, I've had malaria so many times, and just being eaten alive by blood-sucking parasites really isn't my style. And those mosquito nets that some of the Thai Dutanga monks use, it's so fine. It's like pantyhose, where it's so sheer, the holes are so small, so in order to shed rain, that there's almost no air circulation. And I remember there were times, one year that I spent there, one time, less than a full year, I brought one of those Thai, it's called a karat or a glat. It's a great big umbrella with a detachable handle, and you hang mosquito net onto it, and then you can stay underneath and be relatively dry and not be eaten alive by blood-sucking parasitic flies. But there was almost no air circulation at all. So it's like I'd be sitting under that till I couldn't stand it anymore, and then I'd move it aside and be bitten by mosquitoes and flies until I couldn't stand it anymore, and then I'd get back under the mosquito net again till I couldn't stand it anymore, and it would just keep going back and forth like that until it became nighttime and the bats came out and the flies just went away, and the mosquitoes. But I'm just sort of rambling and babbling all over the place, not really answering this question. So let's just get back to the question. Monks are really not allowed to kill in self-defense unless it's inadvertent. They're allowed to strike out in self-defense. And I would use that as a kind of justification. Monks are allowed to strike out in self-defense. This mosquito is literally attacking me, and it could be threatening my life if it has some disease. And like I say, I had falciparum malaria 7 or 8 times, which is the worst kind of malaria. Most people who die of malaria die of falciparum malaria. Once it goes cerebral, you're done for. And when it goes cerebral, that means that, malaria is a blood disease. The parasite, it invades your red blood cells and reproduces inside the red blood cells, and then it breaks the blood cell open as the new baby trypanosomes, I think they're called, come out. And so you've got this wreckage of destroyed red blood cells going through your system. And what happens is, with falciparum malaria, they start causing little localized strokes. You can have like thousands of localized tiny micro strokes, or blockages all through your brain from the capillaries getting plugged with this red blood cell wreckage. And once that happens, it's very difficult to cure somebody. especially if they've got like 106-degree fever besides. So in a case of mosquitoes, I mean, you just have to, you have to take into consideration all the possibilities, all the options. And in some cases, you may just decide it is worth my while to break this rule under this circumstance. So I was owning it. I mean, I wasn't trying to like claim that I wasn't guilty, like just fighting, just self-defense, just kill the mosquito in self-defense. I mean, I wasn't trying to indulge in that kind of sophistry. It's like I was confessing the offense of slapping mosquitoes when I was slapping them. And it was only, as a general rule, when I was staying in that one place out in the forest where I just was just like completely vulnerable to mosquitoes and horse flies and deer flies and just, I just could not sit there and be eaten alive. It was just beyond me. So let's see here. I mean, I stayed at one place, Migadawin Monastery up in the hills. It's on the edge of the Shan Plateau, like 45 miles east of Mandalay, up in the hills. And during the rainy season, I mean, it was awful. I mean, you'd have to, if you were gonna pee outside, you had to be like marching in place, like stomping both feet while peeing, which is it takes some getting used to. I mean, it's a skill that has to be learned, I think. Because if you just stayed motionless for just a few seconds, the mosquitoes would just be clustering on your feet and ankles. So, anyways, I mean, there are some monks, I mean, like, for example, I mean, I'm just completely just leaving these questions behind in the dust at this point. But Pa'ao Monastery, Pa'ao Doya in southern Burma, in Mon State, the Pa'ao method has a reputation for being one of the strictest with regard to following Vinaya rules, the rules of monastic discipline. And Pa'ao got infested with bed bugs. The meditation cabins, most of them were infested with bed bugs. And so the abbot, Venerable Pa'ao Sayadaw himself, said something to somebody, and you had like exterminators came to kill off the bed bugs. And this one Australian monk, who's the same Australian monk that I mentioned, who was chased around a monastery with another monk wielding machete, he just put his foot down and he said, "Nope, you're not going to kill my bed bugs. You're not going to kill the bed bugs in this cabin." He just defied them. But, I mean, it gets to a certain point where you have to do something. And even monks are allowed to at least spread their bedding out in the sun to get rid of bed bugs, which kills the bed bugs. This like bed bugs aren't going to survive in blazing sunlight, and generally an ant colony will find them anyway. I've done that before, spread out my bed bug infested bedding out in the sun, and within a few minutes you've got this highway of ants carrying bed bugs back to this hole in the ground. But I mean, I guess you could use the argument that killing is not your purpose, that you're just defending yourself. So, I mean, striking out in self-defense could theoretically be used as a valid argument. It's just that, like, for example, I've mentioned this before. There are certain times in Burma, like at the beginning of the rainy season, there's just like these little gnats that just completely cover the ground. And you cannot walk without squishing them. But you're not really you're not breaking a rule by walking around squishing them, because that is not your purpose. That is not your intention. You're not walking in order to squish these insects. You're just trying to get from point A to point B. For a Jain, that would be problematic. But for a Buddhist, that is not your purpose, you're really not guilty of breaking the rule. So, if your purpose is just not being eaten alive by mosquitoes, maybe, but it would depend a lot on who you talk to, who your preceptor is, that kind of thing, with regard to whether you really are breaking the rule by slapping mosquitoes. And as a general rule, I just owned it. Because I really was. Sometimes you just get pissed off at the little bastards. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cherzaskaziz. And Cherzaskaziz says, have you ever noticed in a group meditation or just within a group of monks that there are no mosquitoes on some people and one person has all of them biting him? It's an exaggeration, he says in parentheses. No, I've never really noticed this, because if you're in a group meditation, especially, you're not really paying attention to what other people are doing. You might notice if you are being bitten by mosquitoes, but obviously you're not going to be looking around seeing if people are getting bitten by mosquitoes when you're supposed to be meditating. Some people apparently taste better or smell better to mosquitoes. I have noticed that, where some people, like, for example, in my case, I was like a horsefly magnet. If I was in a group and we were like walking through the forest, then the horseflies would come after me, because the Burmese are adjusted. They're evolved to live in a tropical climate. And so they wouldn't be covered with sweat. But horseflies are attracted to moisture. Like you may have noticed in the West, you go swimming, like in a river or a lake, you come out, that's when the horseflies come after you, when you're all wet. They're attracted to moisture. And I would just be drenched in sweat. The Burmese would be fine. I'd be all sweaty, so the horseflies would come after me. But with regard to meditating, yeah, if you notice other people are being bitten by mosquitoes when you're in a group meditation, then you're obviously not meditating. You're just rubbernecking and looking around, see what other people are doing. I remember when I was at Panditarama, there were some mosquitoes in the meditation hall, and it was just something that you just had to endure. I wouldn't even be slapping them, right in front of everybody. It just doesn't look right. It doesn't look good. And there was only a few anyway. So it was just, and it was in Rangoon, so it was not endemic with malaria anyhow. It was just inconvenient and uncomfortable and itchy. But then somebody donated a bunch of like little mosquito nets. They were just like a round mosquito net, and you'd sit inside of it. It wasn't like a long one that like went over a bed. It was just enough room for you to sit inside. And there was a Bangladeshi monk there who was just delighted. He was like a kid on Christmas morning, wide-eyed. It's like, can we use those? Are those for us? And I didn't even want to use them just because, I wanted to be the ascetic, but I don't remember if I even used them, even though they were available. Just some macho thing, I think. Just sit there and get bitten by mosquitoes, just in order not to be a wimp. Anyhow, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Ethiopian Fake Tig. And Ethiopian Fake Tig says, you have on various occasions said you would not explain dependent co-arising, and recently, as I have tried to read Martin Heidegger, I came across a sort of definition of my own and wanted your thoughts on it. Since everything is impermanent, then nothing can't last forever. Meaning something is born and it dies and becomes nothing. But since impermanence affects everything, nothing itself must become something at some point. Could this be a definition for why there is something now and how it won't exist soon and how it will exist again in the future? And I have to admit, I don't fully comprehend this question. It's let's see. Since everything is impermanent, then nothing can't last forever. And I mean, it seems like that might be bad English. It might be that something or anything can't last forever because everything is impermanent. So, I mean, everything can't last forever. Nothing really can last forever. Meaning something is born and it dies and becomes nothing. Well, that's not necessarily true. I mean, just because something is impermanent doesn't mean that it becomes nothing. You know, it can just dissolve into its constituent parts. Like when a person dies, they're dead, but they don't become nothing. You know, there's still, you know, their karmic momentum has passed on and become, what is it called? Something relinking consciousness, birth relinking consciousness, something like that. You know, their body is still there, decomposing. You know, so it's not like if something is impermanent that it just suddenly becomes nothing. Like this cup is impermanent, but probably what's going to happen is it's not just going to poof out of existence. It's going to break and get thrown away and become shards of a cup in some landfill somewhere. So it doesn't really become nothing. It just changes form until it no longer is identified as cup or living being or whatever. Let's see, but let's continue here. Since everything is impermanent, then nothing can't last forever. Meaning something is born and it dies and becomes nothing. Well, we already discussed that. But since impermanence affects everything, nothing itself must become something at some point. Okay, well, that's kind of, I mean, nothing itself. I mean, once you're saying nothing itself, it's not nothing anymore. I mean, nothing itself. I mean, you've already identified it as something. It's just something that's called nothing. Nothing itself, but still, you're calling it an it. You know, you've labeled it. I mean, it's obviously something, at least conceptually. The human mind can't deal with nothing. So we're dealing with samsara and symbolism, perceptions, and dualism. So something and nothing, or nothing and everything, you know, they're opposites. But it's kind of like Nibbana and samsara. It's so long as you're in dealing with samsaric dualism, then yeah, they kind of counterbalance each other. In a way, they're sort of opposites, at least from some points of view. So again, a nothing and something. I mean, even nothing is a something if you've named it and are dealing with it as an it. So anyways, let's continue here. See, but since impermanence affects everything, nothing itself must become something at some point. Yeah, from like the psychology of samsara, that might be true. Although even nothing is already something if you've named it and are calling it it. You know, it's like zero. Zero is still something. You know, it's at least it's a number. Could this be a definition for why there is something now and how it won't exist soon and how it will exist again in the future? Well, I mean, it could be a definition or a kind of explanation, maybe a kind of vague explanation. Golly. I mean, not everybody would explain things in the same way. So not everyone would explain it that way. Maybe the Buddha would not have explained it that way, but I mean, it does seem to be plausible as a kind of explanation. Could this be a definition for why there is something now and how it won't exist soon and how it will exist again in the future? Well, you need stuff changing all the time. So there is that. I mean, dependent core rising requires change. I mean, if nothing changes, that's death. And if everything is changing, then that's meaningless chaos. So you have to have a dependently co-rising balance between like stasis and change. Which, I mean, I've tried to explain this before. Maybe I shouldn't try and explain it again. Gosh. This is taking a lot out of me, this Q&A. Could this be a definition for why this is a difficult question. Could this be a definition for why there is something now and how it won't exist soon and how it will exist again in the future? I mean, if you consider that to be the way dependent co-arising works, where you always have to have some kind of contrast. In order to have a world of multiplicity, you have to have contrast. Again, I bring this up frequently. Hegel's logic begins with the first thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The first thesis, Hegel's philosophy, at least in his logic, starts with the thesis of pure being. And then the antithesis of pure being is pure non-being. And according to Hegel, they just merge together. They can't be differentiated because neither one of them has any distinctive characteristics. There's nothing discernible in either of them. They just merge. And for the rest of Hegel's philosophy, he just assumes that everything and nothing are synonyms. They're interchangeable. Everything, nothing, the same. So then he has to have the synthesis, which is contrast. There has to be a contrast between some perceived distinction between this being and not being. It's this is A, everything else is not A. So you have to have that contrast between A and not A in order for anything to exist, at least in a perceptual samsaric context. So everything has to be changing too. So you have to have some kind of impermanence. I mean, the world is just, samsara is designed that there has to be some kind of impermanence going on and contrasts. So, yeah, I mean, it all works out that way, but I think it might be beyond my capacity to fully explain exactly how it happens. Especially just sitting here, not being able to just sit here and ponder it for 5 minutes in silence before giving an answer. But I mean, it could be used as an explanation for how things happen. Not that something becomes nothing. It's just because something is impermanent doesn't mean that it just poofs out of existence. It just changes form until the form is no longer identified with what it used to be. Matter, just going with physics, matter is neither created nor destroyed. It just changes form. Although, of course, in quantum physics, you've got particles and antiparticles that appear out of nothing supposedly, but we don't need to get into that. And so I'm just going to move on to Ethiopian Fake Tig's second question. He says, you mentioned having tried various substances in the past. Have you tried MDMA, and how do you like it compared to other compounds? And is MDMA the same as ecstasy? I mean, whether it is or not, I haven't taken MDMA or ecstasy. Ecstasy was just starting to come into fashion around the time that I became a monk. And then after I stopped being a monk, I just never encountered it. Never encountered any opportunity. Nobody I knew had any. I wasn't particularly even looking for it. So just for whatever reason, ecstasy and or MDMA is a substance that I have no experience with personally. So I can't really compare it to other compounds. I've heard it's very nice. People back when people were going to raves, there was a lot of that going on. But I've never been to a rave either. I just missed out on all that. So I'm just going to move on to Ethiopian Fake Tig's third question. He says, having heard all your talks, you speak a lot about your dad, but not about your mom. Could you perhaps talk more about her and what sort of person she was and her general temperament towards you? Okay. I mean, one reason why I don't talk about my mother much is I don't want to seem like I'm denigrating her. because, I mean, how do I put this? It's like spiritually, she was a child. My father spiritually was relatively mature. My mother spiritually, I mean, she was this kind of a normie. And she just kind of got she didn't have a spiritual or religious or philosophical bone in her body. Just normie. And she was raised in poverty during the Depression as a child. She married the first man that proposed to her just to get out of like a dysfunctional family. And then he beat her and so forth. She had 8 children that I know of, most of whom I've never met. My mother was married 5 times. My father was also, incidentally, so that's 10 marriages between my 2 parents. And she just did not have much depth to her as people go. I mean, she wasn't stupid, but I mean, she had a 9th grade education. And she said that she dropped out of school just because she was ashamed of just wearing ragged clothes and stuff. I mean, she came from a poor family during the Depression. You know, it was just, watched a lot of TV. And she tried to be a good mother, at least to my brother and me. I mean, most of her kids, she did not raise to adulthood. You know, she'd move on to a different husband or something. But see, I mean, you may understand now why it may seem that just describing my mother may seem like I'm like disrespecting her. But I mean, she did the best she could, the best she knew how, made a lot of mistakes in her life, didn't learn very much from a lot of those mistakes. And my father prophesied a long time ago that she would die alone. You know, she had 8 kids and none of her kids were taking care of her. I was a monk in Burma at the time. I couldn't really take care of her well in her old age. And one day, as she got older, her balance was not so good. And she just fell down in a parking lot, you know, walking out to her car. She just lost her balance, fell down, hit her head on the pavement, and that was it. She was no longer in this world. And now I hear about this when I was in Rangoon, Burma at the time. And it's like, in a way, I was kind of grateful that she died so easily. You know, it was just quick and merciful, quick and painless, which was about the best you could hope for. I remember my father once told my father's told me once, he told my mother that there's a lot worse things that can happen to a person than dying. And my mother thought that was the stupidest, most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard of. What could possibly be worse than dying? You know, she was afraid of death. You know, she was just in and of the world. And so it was like a small mercy that when she did die, you know, it was just fall down, hit her head, boom, and that's it. You know, no prolonged illness, no prolonged suffering. You know, it was just quick and painless. And so, I mean, I had a certain gratitude for that. You know, not that I was happy that she died, of course, but that she was able to go so mercifully, so to speak. But, I mean, she really, I mean, I don't know how to say this. It's like Edgar Cayce used to say that you tend to have a strong karmic connection with one of your parents, but usually not both. And my strong karmic connection apparently was with my father and not with my mother. My mother and I were pretty much on different planets about when I reached about the age of 13. I kind of outgrew my mother's attitude when I was like 13 years old. My father and I remained like not only father and son, but friends. You know, we could hang out and have interesting conversations and so forth. And my mother and I, we were just not on the same planet fairly early on. And with regard to me being a monk, she just did not comprehend it at all. She would much prefer to have grandchildren to spoil. I mean, she just did not understand Buddhism at all. In fact, she wouldn't even say Buddhism. She said, "Do you think you'll always belong to that religion?" And I mean, she just didn't understand it. And she just kind of had a certain humble, respectful attitude towards me. I mean, she didn't understand me. She knew I was smarter than her. Not that I'm trying to brag or anything. And I remember one time I was a monk just visiting my family. I was staying at my dad's house, and my mother came to visit me, and I was trying to do something on the computer, and I was a little bit sort of impatient with it. And so I was kind of frowning when I saw my mother come in, mainly because I was already frowning at, some kind of fuckery on the computer. And she saw that when she came in, I was frowning at her. She just said, "Oh, I'm sorry." She just offered to leave, and then I have to say, "No, it's okay. I'm just frustrated with what's going on this computer. Please stay," But I mean, she adopted this really kind of humble, I mean, I don't know how to really express it. She was just kind of very deferential to me in my adult years. She could not understand me. And like I say, we were on different planets. But I mean, I really, I appreciate that she did do a good job as my mother, as well as she could. I remember one time I was maybe 13 years old, and I shoplifted something from a store, and my mother found out about it. She was doing detective work. She figured it out that I had shoplifted this thing. And when she found out, first of all, she started crying and ran from the room, which made me feel about this big. To make your own mother cry just with shame over you is not good. And then she made me take it back and apologize, which is something a good mother would do. I mean, she did try to be a good mother within her somewhat limited means. Anyway, I think that's enough reminiscing about my mom. I hope she's in a better place now. I really do. I hope she did. She made a lot of mistakes in her life, but I do hope that she had more positive than negative on the ledger, more merit than demerit, or just was able to progress in this life so that she's kind of in a better situation than she was. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is the last question. And this is from Yoshi Bui, who submitted this question under Q&A number 119. So it's almost a coincidence. Well, maybe not. But I did. I mean, it's not necessary that I will notice if someone leaves a comment to an older Q&A. Usually, if I'm collecting the questions and putting them on the list, I just go to the most recent videos and look at the comments under that, and then go to the Discord server. And if anyone emailed me a question, usually more often than not, I'll remember that and go to the email. I'll go to my inbox and get that. But if you do ask questions, it's best to leave them under the most recent Q&A, because if you leave them under an older Q&A, there's less of a chance that I'll notice it. So that having been said, Yoshi Bui says, let's see, quote, "Karma can be viewed as retribution, although it's not any kind of a conscious purpose behind karma. It's just the way it works out a lot of the time," unquote. And I assume he's quoting me from a previous Q&A. So then he continues, is this similar to how we see certain electromagnetic frequencies as colors when in reality there's no color to it? It wasn't meant to be color, so to speak. Well, I mean, I can just go off on a complete tangent with regard to this, that people have been seeing colors, people have been perceiving colors much longer than people have been perceiving electromagnetic frequencies. And so, from my unorthodox, weird point of view, I think that the color may have come first, and then just as people start looking deeper and investigating more deeply, they have to create some deeper foundation for color. And so they come up with electromagnetic frequencies or wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation. So it may be that electromagnetic radiation didn't even really exist until it got like nailed down by physicists and kind of got locked in to our world, locked into our version of samsara. But let's just set that aside. Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that materialistic scientism is true, at least at the samsaric level, and that visible light is really just certain bandwidth of electromagnetic radiation. Or, if you prefer, photons. So, my view of karma, where it can be viewed as retribution, although it's really not any kind of conscious purpose behind karma. You know, it's just the way it goes. It's just the way it works. And it can be interpreted that way, and it seems to work that way sometimes in some contexts. And there's something I could say about karma, and I might as well. So let's just digress wildly again. I've got this idea about karma. There's a certain person who asks questions on this Q&A, on these Q&As, who doesn't believe in karma, especially the whole retribution aspect of it. And I have to admit that I don't think that like karmic retribution is really the way a lot of people see it, where it's like you commit murder. I shouldn't say the word on YouTube, I guess. You perpetrate a homicide, which means you're going to have to be the victim of a homicide in the future, in like some future life, if not this one. You know, let's say somebody becomes deceased in this life, and then you can have some psychic say, well, it was because they were a Roman soldier in the 2nd century AD who was homiciding or retiring barbarian villages. And so this is the retribution of that. And I don't think it necessarily works that way. It's like you are creating your own reality. And so if you are creating a kind of violent reality with lots of dishonesty and insensitivity to others and stealing and so forth, that you're just creating a world that contains that. And so it's more likely to be happening to you. Or it's like a foolish person is like a bad driver. So a bad driver is just more likely to get in a wreck because they're just using less intelligence and less insight, less caution, less situational awareness. So it's like your foolishness causes these bad things to happen just because of sloppiness and recklessness more than, I did this and therefore it's going to have to happen back to me in the same way just because I did that. And so it's like that act is going to have to happen back to me. I don't think it necessarily works that way. It's just you create a world with violence in it. It's more likely that violence is going to come back on you. You create a world with dishonesty in it through your own lying, for example, then you just put it out there. You're living in a more dishonest world because you are creating this world through your own perceptions. And so it just comes back at you sooner or later just because it's there. You've contaminated your own environment. So, it's sort of like in dreams. You might have a dream where something bad happens to you. It doesn't mean that in some other previous dream, you did that same bad thing to some other being. It's just your own mind is creating it. And because you're not entirely wise, not entirely conscious, you just create nightmares sometimes. And I think that in our waking state, some people, without necessarily having done evil deeds, create nightmares for themselves just through lack of skill at like driving the vehicle of their own samsaric being. But let's get back to the question at long last. So is this similar to how we see certain electromagnetic frequencies as colors when in reality there's no color to it? It wasn't meant to be color, so to speak. I could say there's a certain analogy that could be made that, just because something is seen a certain way doesn't mean that it was intended to be that way through some conscious decision. It's just kind of a byproduct, a secondary characteristic, that kind of thing. So, yeah, maybe, you could look at it that way, that karma is just the kind of, it's sort of like a byproduct of human psychology or just worldly psychology. It's just sort of a symptom of how our mind works, like duality. That would be like another symptom. Multiplicity is like a symptom of how our mind works. Impermanence is like a symptom of how worldly samsara functions. It wasn't like nobody decided that it was going to be that way. It just works out that way. So, there might be more like appropriate analogies that could be made, but I don't think I want to sit here and try and think of one. But it's kind of similar to how we see electromagnetic frequencies as colors, or colors as electromagnetic frequencies, which I think might be a little more accurate. Oh, my golly. For some reason, this has been kind of a strenuous Q&A. I've been exercising my brain muscles in this Q&A. But now we're done, because I'm finished. And so, if you have any questions you think I can answer, feel free to ask. No more than 3 questions per person per episode, please. Like and subscribe if you have not done so already. Check out the URL links below, including the new book that has me attacking another monk for half a second. And be happy.